Warning. Despite what the name may suggest, cat CPR does not demonstrate how to perform CPR on a cat, though it is understandable that you came here thinking that it does. If your precious kitty cat is having an actual feline medical emergency, then stop listening to this now and contact your veterinarian immediately. However, once the emergency is over, we welcome your return. Thank you.
The question is, why is the Greek so different? Because the gospel...
Writing style, is that what
Writing
you're
style,
saying?
yes. The gospel and the epistles are very fluid, very, very great. And that's another reason why people say a fisherman couldn't have written this. The Greek's too refined.
We're losing him.
Not on my watch.
Clear.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Cat CPR. I'm Jeremiah.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to another episode. This time recording in June, so this is going to be released in July. We made it to the summer.
We made it to the summer. Well, it's almost summer.
It's almost summer, but when this episode comes out, it will be summer. And it's already starting to feel like summer in Virginia. We got the heat, we got the humidity, we've got the rain. This is kind of your jam, isn't it? I mean, as a Floridian.
I like this. Now, you might think that's really weird because I have probably the better way to say it is I have very active pores.
Indeed. Indeed.
But I've heard that people who live in hot climates sweat a little bit more because they're used to, being in that hot weather.
Right.
I think it's probably because I have a little extra insulation that I'm trying to get rid of. That I'm working on. So I think that has something to do with it more than anything else.
Okay, but you really like Florida more during the fall. I mean, I remember in the fall when it's really nice and it's like 80 degrees, you're like, see, this is what Florida's like in the fall. This is what it's like in the spring. But even Floridian summers, you like that as well?
It's not bad. So from like the middle to end of October when the humidity starts to go away, like probably November to April, it's amazing. Love the winters, love the falls, love the springs. March is my favorite month. But I don't mind the summers either. But if there was no such thing as air conditioning.
Different story?
Yeah. I mean, that's why people before air conditioning went down to Florida in the wintertime, right? And it took a long time for it to get colonized and, industrialized and people living there because, man, alligators and mosquitoes, right? I mean, nobody wanted to live there. So, and
it's funny because you hear in Europe where they think air conditioning is bad for you. Have you heard this? Like in Spain and in Germany, it's like in the summertime, they won't even cut it on. They'll just open up the windows because they believe that air conditioning is bad for you. And I'm like, man, here's another reason why America is number one. And I know that we do have some listeners in other countries, and I'm not trying to be offensive, but I don't see how y'all do it. I just don't understand it.
Yeah.
But there's one guy who was over there. He was like, yeah, but there's a little bit of hypocrisy there because they don't believe in air conditioning in their homes, but they have it in their car. Yeah. And they will blast that in their car.
Yeah.
So air conditioning in car, good. In homes, bad.
Yeah. And we do have people who listen in Germany,
right?
Australia, and a few other places. Well, I mean, Australia is not Europe, but they're kind of like Europe.
Got that British flavor to them.
Yeah, they do. So hey, nothing. Y'all do you. That's great. Glad you're watching.
But I don't get it.
But Americans, we like our air conditioning.
We do. So, and tomorrow's Father's Day as well. Again, people won't know that. Big happy Father's Day. You guys, you doing anything fun for Father's Day?
Well, Father's Day is on a Sunday, so we have our services, assembly times Sunday morning. Then I drive a couple hours and do service and assembly time in the middle of Virginia. So
normal day
for us. We're going to do some stuff today. I think my kids are working, and so not my job to plan. You know what I mean? I mean, your kids are young, so you gotta plan that stuff.
Right.
But you're one down this year for Father's Day.
Well, no, my daughter's gonna be coming back today. She's coming back tonight. Yeah.
Okay.
She's coming back today from Montana. She was doing a youth camp out there, so she's coming back today. But the nice thing about Father's Day is when it comes to Mother's Day, my wife is the mother of my children. My mom lives with us. We have my wife's mom, my mother-in-law, who we've got to go and do things with. So Mother's Day it's kind of a hassle. I'm not going to say it's a hassle, but it's a hustle. You're hustling from one. It's a much better word for that. We got to edit that, okay? I mean, you're hustling from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and it's hard to make it feel special for one individual person because you're considering everybody. Mm-hmm. Now, me on the other hand, my dad lives in West Virginia. We don't really talk anymore. My wife's father, he passed away a couple years ago, so I'm kind of like the only dad, so it's like, so
do you want a couch where we can lay down and you can do, you can lay down and we can do the therapy thing? It's about your dad.
No, it's not therapy. I'm feeling feeling good about it, you know? It's like today where it's like, you know, I don't really have to worry about anyone else but me. But it's like you, it's I do what I think a lot of dads do. It's like, it's kind of business as usual.
Yeah.
It's kind of business as usual.
Yeah. I mean, it's a holiday made up to sell grills. You know?
Right.
So,
Truly.
you know, and I've received those before. So
I have
it's kind of, and sorry, it's weird. I've got the camera in a different location. Hopefully it's okay. But I'm like looking over here thinking that's where the camera was, because it's normally over there. So I do.
A little getting used to.
It's a little odd.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So a lot to do before tomorrow.
Yeah. This is one of them.
And this is one of them.
Yeah.
And did we talk about in the last episode what we were getting into in this episode? I feel like we did.
We did. We talked that we're going to be getting into the writings of John, but we didn't discuss what specifically we're going to be getting into. So we're actually going to divide this up into a couple different episodes like we have in the past. So yes, we're still talking about canon. I mean, but who doesn't like a little, you know, first century literary detective work? I mean, this is what we're trying to do here, is figuring out, you know, what's supposed to be in the Bible and what's not.
I mean, it's really responsive, because these days you see so many people are trying to pick apart the Bible and take it apart. So we believe that it's our job and our role in this podcast to respond to those things. You know, if you're going to try to pick it apart a million different ways, well, let's try to refute or address those things a million different ways.
Yes. And this one specifically, because, you know, we've looked at a few other ones. You know, Paul, that one was an easy one comparatively. Yes, we did 2 episodes talking about, you know, the proactive and responding to the critics. But that one was actually pretty easy. The synoptics, a little bit harder. You know, we're at boss level with these next 2 ones. You know, nobody in the historical critical world believes that the Apostle John wrote these.
Really?
Nobody.
So whereas with Paul, there's some people who are like, yeah, there's some people like, no. With John, it's more or less across the board, no. He's not the one who wrote these things. No,
absolutely not. Matter of fact, if we can find some clips, maybe we'll play some insert here. But, you know, there's people like Bart Ehrman, Alex O'Connor, and a lot of other folks, you know, because one of Alex O'Connor's big things, and I appreciate his arguments a lot of times, but sometimes, like with this, I think it's a little bit of a straw man. When he makes the claim in debates, Jesus never claimed to be God. And people are like, well, what about the Gospel of John? Because that's typically where people go. Sure. I mean, John 1:1, right?
John 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. John 10. I mean, all kinds of places, right? He says, but John didn't really write that. Scholars say that John didn't really write that. And let's actually look at the proactive evidence today, which is what we're going to do. But even though we have this proactive evidence that John wrote these things, and that a lot of the criticisms came later.
The criticisms are always coming later.
But
recent, yes, right?
Yes. But this is going to be a little bit different. So when we get into the next episode, like I said, next episode's going to be, we're going to do a lot of the criticisms. We're going to steel man the arguments.
Okay.
All right. Opposite of straw man. I actually want to show people in their own words, with their own evidence, and what they believe about this. I don't want to do a caricature. I hate that word. I can never pronounce it right. Caricature of the evidence and knock it down and say, see, how silly is this?
Right.
Because that happens on the internet all the time.
It does.
Right. So we don't.
And then people are just in a position to, you know, well, do I believe this person? Do I believe that person? It's yeah.
Yep.
It doesn't build a lot of conviction. It seems like it's more emotionally driven.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the proof and evidence that these guys present, it's not based on the internals of the book, and it's not based on the patristic early church writers, because that's actually pretty solid. Although there is a little bit of debate on 2nd and 3rd John, even early on, especially 3rd John.
Okay. And
there's a little bit of debate later on about Revelation. We're going to get into some of that today.
Sure.
But we're really going to dive into it in the next episode. But really where they get a lot of their struggle with accepting the Apostle John is they say the theology. They call it a high Christology.
High Christology.
Right.
Not Christology? Christology?
That's how
that's
it's
the
pronounced.
pronunciation? Okay.
Yeah. Pronunciations are weird.
They are.
So some of these I struggle with. Like these are called the Johannine, but they're also called the Johannine, Johannine, writings of John.
Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
I mean, these are terms that people are not familiar with. I ran into somebody not too long ago who was listening to the Pauline episodes of Cat CPR, and when he first heard the term Pauline, he was like, "What books of the Bible are these guys talking about?
Yep.
Who is Pauline?"
Right.
And did she write a book of the Bible? I've never heard of it. So these are new terms, and I get it. But it's we got to get used to them. Okay.
We do have to get used to them. But the high Christology, back to that concept, it's how Christ is viewed, and it looks like a more advanced, evolved view of Christ that wasn't presented anywhere else. So they're saying, oh, this was written in the 2nd century to combat Gnosticism. It was written to combat Gnosticism, but Gnosticism, as we saw before with Paul and answering the critics,
right?
Gnosticism's been around for a long time, and the seeds of Gnosticism have been around since like the 4th, 5th century BC with Platonism and Neoplatonism.
And we still see them today. People may not refer to it as Gnosticism, but if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck,
it's a duck.
It's a duck.
Yeah, absolutely. So this stuff has been around for a while. So I mean, John did combat with a guy named Cerinthus that we talked about. So what we're going to look at with the proactive stuff, I think is going to be helpful with all of this. So, we're going to go ahead and look at the writings of John. So we have the Gospel of John, we have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and we have the book of Revelation.
5 total. Okay.
5 total. And like I said, there's all different types of things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the 2 John theory a little bit today. That's one of the criticisms, and the proactive stuff, we're going to have to deal with that a little bit. But again, that's going to be next episode. So we'll do the steel manning of the arguments next episode.
Okay.
But this episode, we're going to present the proactive case.
Great. Excellent. Well, let's get into it.
Yep. All right. So roadmap for today. Think of this as like the table of contents for the episode. First thing we're going to do is we're going to do a book roll call, which actually we just did. We listed the names of the books, but we're going to go into each book, talk about the date, and lay out a few pieces of groundwork there. And then we're going to do the cross-book fingerprints, essentially. How do we know that the guy who wrote John wrote 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John, and Revelation?
Which is what we did sort of with the Pauline letters as well.
Yep.
Does it sound, is it the language and words that Paul would normally use? Same thing with John, right?
Exactly. Because that makes sense.
Well,
I mean, again, remember Ehrman's criticisms. This doesn't sound like him. The sentence structure's off, and the long sentences and all of these types of things. The hapax legomena, the unique words.
How can you say hapax legomena and struggle with caricature?
That's a really good question. I don't know. It's weird. I know,
Okay,
right?
All right. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, but thanks for calling me
You're
out
a
on
complex individual, Matt Hartford.
No,
Complex. All right.
I'm not actually that complex. It's there's a lot of holes in there. So,
All right.
So the cross. So what was I talking? Oh,
you were talking about legomena? No, habamina. What were you? Okay, sorry.
Hamana. So, and what we did is we looked in there and said, but no, it is consistent. It's not that we want to look at these things and say, oh, it doesn't matter the style, and they could be completely different, completely, weird and different from each other, and that's okay. No. That's not it. But Revelation is very different from the other 4 books. Very different.
I don't think anybody would argue that.
No, it's different from everything in the Old and New Testament. So
dare we say different from it? Yeah, I mean the whole Bible, it's different. So
it is.
Probably a good reason why it's the last book, but yeah.
It is. And so what I find interesting is that there's a lot of evidence for this that was written by John. So I'm excited about that. So God kind of let that be saved. But there's a reason why Revelation is written the way it's written, and we're going to dive into that. And then we're going to look at the early patristic shout-outs. Hey, what the early church writers say. Again, we don't look at them for doctrine. Right.
Because I got hung up on that a little bit,
No, I'm not talking about you.
No. But I'm talking about me.
Yeah.
It's like when I was looking at that, there's a few things he said. I was like, well, that's questionable. But if we look at it for what evidence does it affirm by
Mhm.
what they state, not the doctrine that they're promoting? What does that give us?
Exactly.
So I get it.
Exactly. History, it's great. Hey, what was in rotation, what was being circulated, and even the people that had negative views
Mhm.
of the books, actually, that lets us know that those books were in circulation because they feel like they had to do a negative
Right.
comment on it.
Right.
So we'll go ahead and do that. Then we're going to go ahead and check the canon lists that are out there. We'll look at the Muratorian fragment.
Do we see it in the earlier
Yep.
preservations? Yeah.
Exactly. And we're going to do something a little different. So I've been working on the textual criticism stuff, and I thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool, especially with John, because he's so contested? Let's take a look at some of the manuscript evidence.
Great.
Right.
Great.
So the early codices, and that's really cool as well. And then we'll check out, why it matters. We'll look at the councils that recognized it. And I think this is an interesting statement. I didn't come up with it. It says that they don't conjure apostolic origin drives canonicity, not vice versa. So in other words, they don't create the canon, they recognize the canon. And that's something we've talked about, but we're going to really kind of nail that down.
Excellent.
So, John goes from this Galilean fisherman to like this theological heavyweight. So we're going to go ahead and look at this, and we're going to jump into it before you can say Tetelestai.
Which means
It is finished.
Hey, all right. I'm excited about that.
I like so John's the only gospel that includes the it is finished, and it's Tetelestai. And
So you're wondering why Matt threw that Greek in there. It wasn't just to flex his ability to pronounce Greek. It's because there's a connection there. I see that.
Because pronunciations, my Greek pronunciation is horrible.
Really?
Yeah.
So do we need to go back and check to see? I mean, what about that? I mean, it sounds pretty good to me.
I put the accent mark in there. So I could pronounce it correctly, but I'm pretty sure there's somebody that's going to be like, you didn't pronounce that right. I'm like, you know what? I don't care. Doesn't matter.
One thing I was thinking as we're kind of shifting into the next one is I was having Bible study with a couple not too long ago when we were going through Mark chapter 1, and we were talking about why Jesus would select fishermen. Because these days, when most people think about what is a qualification of a preacher, or people use the pastor, and they might not always use that term correctly, but what are the qualifications? They say someone who went to seminary, or somebody who's got a theology degree or something like that. And when you look at the people that Jesus selected to help build the church and spread the gospel message, fishermen. And we could talk endlessly about the qualities of a fisherman and, why, they would make good preachers. They got patience. They're willing to throw out different lures. They're willing to go to different spots to see who's biting when and where, and, I don't know. There's just something about that kind of resonates with me where it's like, we're looking for something more than just what's on the surface.
Sure.
Sure.
Absolutely. And what's interesting with those fishermen, they didn't do any of it. They didn't do the lures and stuff. They just threw nets overboard.
They just threw nets out, right? They weren't even very good fishermen. Hey, you guys aren't very good at fishing. So, no, I don't know how great they were at fishing, but.
Yeah. Well, when Jesus was around, they were awesome.
No joke.
They were fantastic.
We need Jesus to come and fish with us.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's dive into the Gospel of John.
All right.
And we're going to be, we're going to be opening things up and seeing some of the connections, because again, we're going to do this one a little bit differently because they are so contested in a lot of ways. So I want to really lay out some of this proactive aspect.
Let's do it.
The date and time we're looking, and again, these dates are very, very different. So if you follow someone who's more of a preterist, where they believe that the Bible was finished before 70 AD,
i.e. before the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yes, before the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right. Because again, if it's after that, that kind of people will say that him predicting the destruction, there's no way he could do that.
Right.
It had to have been written after.
Right. Exactly. But you have a lot of people that no, I shouldn't say a lot. Preterism, I haven't run into a lot of them. I've run into a few, but they say that all of the prophecies of the second coming were fulfilled in the second century, or in 70 AD. Book of Revelation was all finished by 70 AD as well. So I don't hold to that.
I also don't hold to that.
Yeah. So full and fair disclosure, we don't hold to that. So the Gospel of John, possibly written anywhere between 80 and 90, is what I've seen as far as the main consensus, and probably from Ephesus. So if we're looking at John, one of the
where he wrote it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, where he wrote it. John's headquarters later on in life was Ephesus,
which is modern day Turkey.
Modern day Turkey, and we'll see this when we get into the Book of Revelation a little bit. that actually plays a big part in the second and third chapter of the book of Revelation. So we'll see that in a second. So probably from Ephesus after the fall of Jerusalem.
Okay.
So this is why a lot of people say, well, it had to have been written before, because why doesn't he mention it? Okay, so let's assume for a second Washington, D.C. was destroyed 10 to 20 years ago. Do you think we would need to mention it so that our readers understood that Washington, D.C. was destroyed 10 to 20 years ago?
No.
No, everybody would know it.
Everybody would know it.
It'd be like, referencing the World Trade Center 10 years after 9/11, 2001, right? It's just not necessary.
Right.
So I don't see that as a huge issue whatsoever.
Not to be confused with not important. We're just saying in terms of what we're talking about, it's not necessary. There's no context involved. Okay.
Exactly.
Never forget. Yeah, we're not going to forget. We're just saying, all right.
Exactly.
All right.
It's like everybody. Now, we've got people that are coming up now that are questioning that. It happened?
Not that it happened.
Okay, I'm about to say, it's like, are we there already? No, but that will happen.
That will happen. I'm not convinced that 9/11 even actually happened. Yeah, okay.
See, well, I find the new generation coming up where they're like, the space shuttle wasn't real. We actually don't go to space.
We didn't land on the moon.
We didn't land on the moon. Look, I get people have reasons why they don't believe that. Okay, I'm not going to debate that. I don't think it's important. I choose to believe it. I think it's really cool. So if it's not true, let me live in my delusion. But I worked on the space shuttle, not as like an engineer, but I worked construction out at the launch pads while the space shuttle was on the pad. I've seen it land and like, oh, it lands under the power of its own engines. No, it doesn't. I was on top of sorry, this is a total segue.
That's okay.
But it's okay.
Yeah, we're here.
I was on top of a satellite clean room that we were cleaning to have the repair parts for the Hubble telescope to go in there. They basically put a big contact lens on it. And they had to I almost died there, by the way. But that's another story for another time. I literally
Did you try to put in that huge contact lens?
No, okay. I was up on top and I never used to be afraid of heights. I'm jumping around like a monkey up there, like swinging on branches almost.
Yeah.
And I made a mistake and I almost fell off up top where it was like 10 stories straight down and there was nothing. So
and thus Matt's appreciation for gravity increased dramatically that way.
And thus my fear of heights started. But so I'm up there in the top. They have a big crane that rolls along that area where they lift things up, and I'm up there, and there's a door that goes to the outside. It's two different heights, and so I could walk out onto the roof. And I heard the boom, boom, the sonic booms of the shuttle landing. Now, a lot of times the shuttle didn't land at Kennedy; it landed in California or New Mexico, and White Sands, New Mexico. And so I heard the boom, boom, and I'm like, "Oh, this is going to be cool." So I go out there, and I hear jet noises, right? And so the chase jets go and they move away. So they come up, and then I just hear this whooshing sound, and it's a little hazy in summertime in Florida, and below the haze, right there, I see the shuttle come down below the haze, right over my head.
So we got eyewitness testimony.
Yes.
Right here and now that shuttles do in fact land.
They do land, not under their own power. It was absolutely silent and it was gliding, and the only sound I heard was the whooshing of the shuttle as it went through, and I could see the landing strip and I watched it land. I tell you the truth before God.
Well, there you go.
That I saw that. And so my wife and I both grew up there, saw the shuttle explode in 1984. That really happened. Okay. So I don't understand all these people that say, these things never happened. No, I've seen so many launches I can't even count.
Sure.
This is legit.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Sorry about that. But these types of conspiracy theories just kind of drive me nuts a little bit.
And we see how fast they're getting here. I mean, again, when did the shuttle explode?
1986.
That was only like 20 years ago. No, that was like 40 years ago.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
40 years ago. And we've already got conspiracy theorists saying that it didn't happen despite eyewitness testimony.
Lots of eyewitness testimony.
How much more are we going to have that if it's 2,000 years removed like the Gospel of John?
And that's kind of my point of bringing this up, because how long is it going to be before, the Twin Towers they never existed. They didn't fall.
I mean, that was 2001.
Yeah.
So I mean,
24
years ago. So add another 15 years and it's going to be just like the space shuttle that blew up in 1984.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Whew. All right.
So, John written 80 to 90, universal audience. And he wrote, if you look at John chapter 20, verse 31, we won't go there right now, but if you look at that you may believe.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he wrote. So this is a universal audience, not necessarily just at that time. God's writing this so that we 2,000 years later still might believe.
Yeah. And
there's some certain interesting internal clues that we want to look at, because this guy, whoever wrote it, was an internal, there are internal clues that he was an eyewitness to what was going on. So
we're already kind of putting together the clues as to, I mean, we say it's written by John.
Yeah.
People will debate that. So we're already starting to look at the clues as to, well, who could it be?
Who could it be?
And we're seeing that this is a person who is an eyewitness.
Yes.
Who could it be? Okay.
So we're going to look at John 21:24, and the glasses come on, and he says this. He says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." So we see that whoever's writing this is stating, I need to verify, because, it is later, we're 50 years,
right,
removed from this. This testimony is true. Mm-hmm. And they always say, okay, well, it's anonymous. Yep, we get that.
Well, it does say it's a disciple. So there's a lot of people who could witness it and were not disciples. So this is telling us, we know at least it's a follower of Jesus.
It's a follower of Jesus. So first clue we have is that this is a disciple who is testifying to these things.
Yep.
Now, this one's kind of powerful. You go to John 19. And again, I know these are internal claims.
Sure.
And so you always have to take them with a grain of salt,
sure,
unless we start to see that the claims pan out.
Right.
All right.
Right.
So John 19, and let's look at verse 35. And he says, "And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe."
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, what we're seeing here is that this individual is claiming to be an eyewitness of the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
Of the crucifixion.
So far we've got a disciple, a follower of Jesus, who was there at the crucifixion, which narrows the possibilities of who wrote it even more so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so here's what we need to be able to determine. This person should give us accurate information, not only about what took place, but about the environment that he lived in.
Right. Right. No, that makes good sense.
So if we're starting to see different aspects of this that don't really fit, right? That don't really fit. He gets names of cities wrong. He doesn't really know the layout of places and doesn't describe them quite well.
Brings up a cultural thing that would not have applied at the time or the place.
Right. So imagine us trying to describe what a place looked like 100 to 150 years after it the events took place.
Right.
We wouldn't get it right.
No, despite the fact that it's so far removed, you'd have trouble remembering it. But I mean, you're as you get older, your memory gets a little bit hazy too, right?
It does. Absolutely. So
I mean, I'm not that old, but I have a hard time remembering what I did yesterday. So
exactly. Now, a little bit earlier in chapter 19, he says. In verse 25, he says, "But standing at the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, 'Woman, behold your son.' And he said to his disciple, 'Behold your mother.' From that hour, the disciple took her into his own household." So we see here the giving, Jesus being the oldest. Joseph's not around anymore, probably dead. Jesus is in charge of taking care of his mom. Mm-hmm. And so
John is in charge of taking care of Jesus' mom.
No, Jesus is in charge of taking care of his mom.
Oh,
so,
okay. Sorry.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah. So Jesus is in charge of taking care of his mom, so that what we see is him saying, "Okay, now John, I want you to
handing it over to John.
Handing it over to John," which we're assuming this is who this is. But that's what we see is that John is the one that took care of her going forward.
So this would be someone who is very close to Jesus, where
Yes.
Jesus would entrust this responsibility to that person.
Yes.
So we're getting even narrower, because Jesus had a lot of followers. This is someone who was an eyewitness of the crucifixion, which narrows it down even more. And this particular individual was so close to Jesus that Jesus entrusted them to take care of his mother after he was gone.
Yes, and remember,
so we're narrowing this.
We're narrowing it
down pretty close, pretty narrow.
And Jesus chose this person over his own brothers,
right?
Because his brothers were not believers at this time. They became believers.
Sure.
Now, I always think it's really interesting that the brothers of Jesus became believers after his supposed resurrection. Right. That's the time that people would have been like, nah, we don't believe in this guy. But they, James and Jude became believers after that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. But it also lets us know that faith trumps flesh in this regard.
That's pretty profound.
We're going to deal with that at another time.
The spiritual family being stronger, deeper than the physical family.
Yeah.
Now we come across that subject matter throughout Scripture, but that's some read between the lines kind of stuff that I like.
Yeah, I think it's very clear and evident here.
Absolutely.
Because
very profound.
if that didn't matter,
right,
then he would have just had his brothers take care of it and he wouldn't have bothered.
Right. Right.
On a side note, I've seen some folks that hold to the elevation of Mary, I guess is the way that I'll say it, state that this is where Jesus gave Mary to the church. Behold your mother.
So I'm getting tones of Catholicism in here.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I look at this and I think, okay, if this is the style of exegesis we're going to go with, man, the Bible, you can make it say anything you want.
Right.
That is not what Jesus said. He says, behold your son. He didn't say, behold your sons, and I'm giving Mary to be here for the church. No, he's simply taking care of mom so that she's got a place.
Right.
And that she's taken care of by someone who's faithful. And
what does that say about Jesus and his character? The fact that he's thinking about the well-being of his mom, literally when he's being executed.
Man,
I've always talked about how Jesus' character is amazing, where he's forgiving the people who are literally driving nails into his flesh while he's being executed. Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. I had never considered this part, where Jesus is thinking about the well-being of his mother, literally while in his dying breath.
Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah.
Whew.
I mean,
this would be a great Mother's Day message. Tomorrow's Father's Day. I don't know what you're preaching on, but man, would that be a great Mother's Day message?
It would be.
Yeah.
It would be.
So put that in your pocket, or I will. Either one.
I will. Tell you what, you do that.
Okay.
We'll let you
Make
go.
sure I have a stewardship or a Lord's Supper meditation or something like that, because that's good stuff. All right, I'm sorry.
It is. No, I'm
diverging a little bit.
I mean, that's okay. That's what our listeners love.
No,
probably.
Just
probably not. They're like, can you just get on with it? These episodes are so long. No, look what Jesus did this whole time frame. He forgave people. He was mindful to fulfill prophecy. He saved a guy's soul, forgave him. He took care of his mom. He's tortured and dying in one of the most brutal ways possible. So I just want to
still got an agenda. Still has an agenda.
I just want to mention this, and then we'll move on.
Okay. How
mentally tough was this guy? And how did he get there?
I think that's probably... Now, most people would just write that off and say, well, because he was Jesus, he was hardwired. Now, I don't doubt that Jesus had some unique qualities about him that made him, suited for what he had to do, but a lot of it came from training.
Yes.
Training. I don't think a lot of people want to hear that, because then they would have to indicate that, well, if there's things that Jesus could do to, be more mindful of things like that, there's also things that I could do. And a lot of people don't want to face that.
It takes away the excuse, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. And put it this way, if Jesus was hardwired and he couldn't fail because he was the Son of God, why did bro spend 40 days before his ministry, after his baptism, not eating food in the wilderness to prepare himself for what was about to take place?
And how could he sympathize with us, as the book of Hebrews states?
Right.
He wouldn't be able to sympathize with us because we are not hardwired like some people say Jesus was hardwired.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jesus was not hardwired like that, but
Well, because he did it as an example for us. Well, I haven't fasted 40 days, and I don't see anywhere in the scripture where it tells me to fast 40 days. So he's not doing it as an example for us as far as something that we need to do.
Right.
I mean, sure, if someone wants to fast 40 days, absolutely go for it. That's great. Just do it correctly and don't die.
Right.
But he's doing it right before his ministry, there's no point if he's hardwired.
Right.
There's no point in that whatsoever. So anyway.
All right. Sorry, that was neither. I mean, we're getting to the preaching segment a little bit, but it's interesting stuff. That stuff is interesting.
It's fun. It's fun.
I don't think we're capable of not looking at scriptures like that and seeing those things and wanting to talk about it.
Right. Exactly.
It's in our nature. Okay.
Right. So
this is a podcast with two preachers. Yeah, you're going to get that.
You're gonna get it. You're gonna get it. And one of us is more verbose than the other.
Well, who is it? Okay.
That's just
Okay, we have one more thing we're going to talk about. More eyewitness markers. Racing to the tomb.
Yeah,
that's where we left. Yeah,
because it was really important. It's really important for John to be like, dude, I'm faster than Peter, right?
There's some great reels about that where Peter's like, John, don't write that. Don't write that.
Okay, so what's the deal between you and John? Basically, he and I were both disciples of Jesus, but when we were racing to the tomb, John beat me there, and he wrote it in his gospel. He just likes to troll, and he thinks it's hysterical.
It's fantastic.
I love it.
I
do. I like it too.
But I personally think that one of the reasons that John doesn't actually state his name here, and he's like, okay, I'm the guy that leaned back on Jesus' chest during the Lord's Supper or during the Passover. We think about these things, and it's like, probably not what we would do, right? I'm not, I've been to dinner at your place. You've been to dinner at my place. We're not snuggling usually.
We're not.
It's not how, but again, different culture, just the way things played out. But we're talking about a guy that physically handled who Jesus is, right? And that's going to become very important when we get over to 1 John. Now, let's think about some other things. He talks about in John chapter 5, verse 2, that Bethesda had 5 porticos. That's really specific. There's all kinds of things like this in the Gospel of John where he lays out geographic things or very specific aspects of who did what and where. Jacob's well was deep in chapter 4:11. Someone who wrote this in the middle of the 2nd century somewhere else isn't going to throw little things like that in there. John would have, because he was there.
Right.
He was there.
Now, somebody could say, well, of course the well is deep. Aren't all wells deep? But like you said, he didn't have to put that in there.
Right. Not necessarily, though. I mean, you have some shallow wells. You've got some deep wells. Somebody's lazy. I mean, think about it. You're digging those things out by hand.
Good point.
As soon as you hit water a little bit, you're going to be like, that's good enough.
Yeah, we're good enough. We got water.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished. Okay.
But then there's also the pre-70 temple courtyards described in detail. Tomb wrappings described in detail. These are the little things that if this is a forgery, these are not the hallmarks of a forgery.
People who are going to do a forgery would probably like to be a little bit more vague.
Yes.
To determine whether, so it would make it harder to prove or disprove.
Yep.
Whereas the fact of John's putting in things in great detail, this is an indicator that he was there, that he saw it, it's going to be a little bit harder to disprove when he's giving that amount of detail.
Exactly. And, why the anonymity then? Well, I personally think John is writing this at the end. He's probably at this point, or very close to it, the last apostle standing. And I just think that there's some humility here that has been brought about by all the things that he's gone through.
Sure.
And he's just not wanting to call attention to himself, So do we kind of, I mean,
do we see that also in the book of Mark? The young man who during Jesus's arrest, somebody tries to catch him and they rip his clothes off and he runs away naked. I mean, there's speculation there that was also Mark.
Yeah.
So we kind of see that with the writers of the Gospels a little bit where they're being vague about.
Yeah.
We don't want to say it specifically, it's me.
Right.
But put the pieces together.
Yeah. And it's like, that's me. I'm the disciple of Jesus loved and I'm faster than Peter. Okay.
Right.
I mean, that's just how we're going to leave it.
Right.
That's where we're going to leave
it.
No,
I can see that. A little bit of humility. A little bit of humility there.
Yep. And so then we get into 1 John. And again, we're just hitting these, kind of high level. Probably 90 to 95 AD from Ephesus. And again, one of the things that we see, if we look over at 1 John chapter 1, he says, what we have seen with our eyes and our hands handled concerning the word of life.
I feel like that's a direct response to Gnosticism.
Absolutely, because they said doceticism, Jesus only appeared to have a body. It wasn't really like ours. The writer of 1 John is saying, guys, I
touched it.
this guy.
Yeah.
I know that he was real. And again, this concept is the same types of concepts that we see in the Gospel of John. I'm testifying you, my testimony is true. So he's laying this stuff out and putting clues in to say, I was an eyewitness. I saw these things.
Right.
And I don't see any credible evidence out there to disprove these types of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And then also the vocabulary is very, very similar. We'll see some of these in a second. You know, there's the same, you know, like staccato type clauses, very abrupt and very, you know, Hebraic in the way that
I've
they're
always
written.
felt like his writings were a little bit poetic in a sense. Like in John chapter 1, you know, the Word was with God and the Word was with God. I mean,
It's beautiful.
I mean, it's very beautifully written, but it's, you know, you could just say, in the beginning was Jesus, Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he could be very direct on there, but it's got a more of a poetic feel to that. And I feel like we see that throughout his books. Maybe a little bit different in Revelation, but, you know, still.
We do. And in fact, John 1 and 1 John 1 have very similar tone, as we'll see here in a moment. But also the same concepts, light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
John in his epistles, that stuff gets laid out there.
Mm-hmm.
Love, hate.
It's like that poetic, more spiritual side
Mm-hmm.
of writing. Yeah.
Yep. And if you think about it, there needed to be a gospel like this.
Right.
Because,
compared to the other ones.
Yes.
Right? Because you got Matthew, where he's going through genealogies. He's bringing up prophecy, which has been very specific to the Jews, things they were interested in. Mark, the gospel written for the Gentiles. We've talked about before how it's a little bit more gritty in its writing. And then you got Luke, written by a physician, and we see a lot of terms that are specific to him. It's obviously written by an educated man. So John is a completely different style.
Very.
A little bit more poetic, a little bit more on the spiritual side, less focus on the genealogies, and he still throws in some prophecy in there, but it's a different writing style.
It is a different.
It seems like it really does kind of help complete the Gospels.
It does, because things did change.
Right.
From in just the 20 years, from the time 30 to 20 years from the time that the synoptics were written, things had changed, and there needed to be a gospel and writings that combated in detail the Gnostic philosophy, because it swept through the churches over the next few centuries.
Right.
And got firmly rooted into the teachings of Augustine. So I'm thankful that we have the writings of John from an eyewitness apostle that's tremendous authority.
Right.
That shows us this.
Yeah. So you're starting to see the reason why his was probably written last too then.
Yes.
You know?
I think
Yeah.
so. I
Interesting.
think so.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay.
2 John, it's written by somebody called the Elder, which we're going to get into here in a second. So that's where some people say, oh, well, you see, this isn't John. But if John is showing this humility where he's not even really listing his name in the gospel, right? And he's not really, hey, I'm John, son of Zebedee. I'm the apostle. I'm that guy, you know? So he calls himself the Elder. But there's another guy named John that some of the other folks talk about that people say, oh, that was probably him. So we're gonna look at that here in a second.
All right.
And so also written between 90 and 95 from Ephesus. It's written to the elect lady and her children, probably not an individual woman, but talking about the specific local congregation that was there. Mm-hmm. And the designation of the elder fits the aged apostle, where John was an old guy at that particular time. Mm-hmm. And also the reason we know that John, the same author, whoever the author was, wrote John and 1 John is because, again, the themes and the vocabulary, the writing style are so similar. Also, 2 John uses the whole Antichrist concept very, very similarly to 1 John. So we know that 2 John was written by the same guy too, because that whole style is there too. And again, we're just building this case slowly and surely.
So I kind of like the way that that's connected, though, because we've talked before about how Paul, it's like, even if writing styles change, that's not necessarily to discredit the writer, because as they mature, as their understanding grows, it makes sense that their writing would change. I mean, I've been in Christ for about 12 years now, and I've been doing meditations the whole time. I've gone back and looked at how I wrote things when I first came into Christ versus recently, and it's there's some similarities, but it's very different. I like how we're connecting the dots here. 1 John and the Gospel of John, we can see those similarities very close. Now, it might be more difficult to connect 2 John to the Gospel of John, but it's easy to connect 2 John to 1 John because
Exactly.
the writings are similar.
Yes.
So, and if these things are written in chronological order, the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, wouldn't it make sense that there may be some differences, whether they be subtle or not, as they progress?
Yes.
If John is growing, if he's maturing, as he's getting older, as he's getting better at what he's doing?
Well, I mean, and this brings up an interesting point, and we'll, dive more specifically into this in the future in another episode. How does inspiration actually work?
Sure.
You know,
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Yeah. God doesn't override the person's personality, style of writing.
Because you see that. I mean, you see that
Absolutely.
in the writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, the scripture lets us know that these are men moved by the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is working with them. We don't know the exact way that this all operates, but we do know that the individual's personality, writing style, all of that stays preserved.
Right.
And the content that gets penned is what God wants it to be.
Hence why you see the difference in the writing styles, but the harmony with the subject matter.
Yes. And so there's objective means by which we can determine whether something is truly inspired of God. And that's where we're going to get into the prophecies going forward, which is super cool.
That is great stuff. Okay.
3 John.
3 John?
3 John. 3 John's the wild card. 3 John didn't really get fully accepted for a little while. Okay. And so when you think, what major doctrines are found in 3 John that need to be, really hammered? I'm not saying it's not an important book, but there's not a lot of. It's short. It's really, really short.
It's short.
And when we think about it, it's really written to combat Diotrephes. Guy was on a power trip, right? So John's sending that out there. And
I feel like it also helps to emphasize the importance of supporting roles, because Gaius was like supporting people in the church, sending them on their way. I think it helps to emphasize, we see so many great biblical heroes that are larger than life, and people want to be that. And that's great if you want to be that. But I feel like 3 John also emphasized the importance of people to serve in those supporting roles. And I kind of wonder, is that part of the reason that's in there, to help emphasize that, even if you're just serving in a support position to help other guys lead, that's really important. So I see the value in it.
I do too. I do too.
But I see what you're saying. It's like, what doctrine in there really needs to be?
Yeah. But I think it's a warning. And I think it's. I think.
I don't know why I'm getting caught up. All right, yeah, go ahead. It's very rarely when you do this. You're like, hold on a second. All right.
So I think it was very poignant and timely, because what we see happening is we see a lot of people in the spirit of Diotrephes starting to rise at this particular time, and not a lot of people in the style and spirit of Gaius. I appreciate Ignatius. I appreciate Ignatius from Antioch. I appreciate the fact that he died for his faith. And it's very easy to throw people under the bus and say, this guy did this, he did that because he doesn't teach this or whatever. The guy died for his faith.
Yeah.
And so there was a tremendous amount of conviction there. And he knew at least one, possibly two of the apostles, according to tradition. But Ignatius is one of the main guys that started the pathway going down of having a singular bishop and multiple presbyters, having the first among equals approach that helped to consolidate the power of the church of each local congregation into a singular bishop, which eventually led to the Bishop of Rome.
Right.
And I think that is the spirit of Diotrephes.
Trying to shut that down.
Who this guy loves to be first among them. And I think 3 John is written at a specifically poignant time. So people think, is 3 John just like this throwaway letter that doesn't really matter because it's not really quoted? Now, I think there's a reason why it wasn't quoted, because it's actually clamping down on the very thing that was going on inside the church at that particular time.
Yeah.
And we need to pay attention to the Gaius and Diotrephes dynamic.
Right.
Have to do that.
Right.
Have to do that. So
it's like how some of these places will purposely not quote certain books because or certain verses because of what it says, and it's in opposition to what they're doing.
Yes. Yes.
Same thing here. We don't want to talk about 3rd John because it's pretty much pointing out that what we're doing is wrong.
Yeah. But it's veiled.
It is. I mean, it doesn't specifically say it.
It's subtle.
It's subtle.
You have to make the extrapolation yourself and say, okay, here's the interpretation. Okay, we got a problem with guys and Diotrephes. What's the application? Application is don't be a Diotrephes. Right? Be
a Gaius.
Be a Gaius. And don't be that guy who wants to be first among everybody.
Sure.
You need to take a step back.
Yep.
And because that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
Exactly what was happening. So people are like, why was 3rd John written? That's why, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, that's why it was written. Revelation.
Ooh.
Okay.
If there has to be one book that has so many different interpretations. I don't think I've ever known of any other book in Scripture that has such a variety of interpretations and thus applications.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to call it. We're going to call it Apocalypse Now and Then.
And then.
Have you ever seen that movie?
Apocalypse Now? Yeah. With what was it Martin Sheen? Martin Sheen? He was in it. Yeah.
And
the guy who played the
Duvall?
Godfather.
Yeah, Duvall. Wasn't it Duvall?
Duvall was in that. Yeah. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Yeah.
That's the line, isn't it?
That's probably what is best known for.
Yeah.
Who was the guy who played the Godfather? Goodness gracious. It's blank. I'm blanking. Anyway. You know what I'm talking about. He was like the guy who Martin Sheen was trying to find the whole time.
Oh.
And he played the Godfather.
I'm skipping.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Anyway.
Oh, this is killing me.
It is.
Okay.
We'll figure it out later.
It doesn't matter. We'll be stuck here
There's
for 5 minutes.
There's going to be a little bit of text in here that says, here's who it was, because I'm going to go back and look at it later so it stops bothering me.
Marlon Brando?
Marlon Brando. That's it. Okay. There's no longer going to be text. Yeah. Marlon Brando. Thank you. Goodness gracious.
Yeah. We need more caffeine.
Yeah.
All right.
Thespians everywhere is like, it's Marlon Brando. How can you not recognize it's Marlon Brando? Okay.
Yeah. So 95 to 96 AD.
Yep.
On exile in Patmos under the reign of Domitian was where he was during this time frame.
Yep.
So primary audience writing to the churches, the 7 churches of Revelation, but also to the church as a whole, because that number 7 is a symbolic number for completeness and perfection. So again, I'm teaching on Revelation right now. So
pretty fresh.
Yeah, it's pretty fresh.
Pretty fresh.
But here's where so it says I, John, 3 times in the first chapter. So we know that. But
really emphasizing he's the one who's doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the evidence we're going to see, it was John the Apostle, very clearly. So we'll get to that in a second. But one of the internal evidences, again, the Greek is very different, but one of the internal evidences is the order of the 7 churches. It starts in Ephesus. And it is how you would travel using the Roman road system at that time to all of those churches in order.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
So it follows the Roman road system and, gets you to Laodicea at the end.
So if these letters were going to them in chronological order, it would...
Geographic.
You're right.
Yeah, geographic order. That's exactly how.
Right.
That's so cool.
That is pretty cool.
So there's that little internal evidence that these were designed to really go out from Ephesus, which is where John was.
That's good stuff.
He was on Patmos, but that was his headquarters.
Right.
So that's how that works. And so he displays, kind of boots on the ground familiarity with everything, all the way down to Laodicea's lukewarm water supply. Right. So this is a guy who's an eyewitness and knows these places, because every single one of the things that he writes to these churches, it's very, very specific. Pergamum, where Satan's throne is, the center of emperor worship, all different kinds of these aspects.
Right.
So now the question is, why is the Greek so different? Because the gospel...
Writing style, is that what
writing style, yes. Yeah. The gospel and the epistles are very fluid, very, very great. And that's another reason why people say a fisherman couldn't have written this. The Greek's too refined. It's like, the guy's been... So let's say 30 AD is when Jesus died. He hadn't been a fisherman for 50 to 60 years.
Right.
He had been focused on preaching the gospel and learning and becoming an orator and all of these other things. Wouldn't he have had an education? I mean, all of us started off as pretty plain. I didn't have a great private school education, and I taught good sometimes. I talk okay. My writing has definitely gotten better
Sure.
from when I was in high school. You learn.
I mean, I have no problem with this. I'm not a college-educated individual, and my boss, who has a PhD, says, "Will you please write a correspondence that's going to go to all Virginia judges?" Mm-hmm. I mean, I can write even though I'm not an educated individual.
And you're writing to judges,
right? So I mean, I've got no problem with this whatsoever. And plus, I mean, I would also like to think again, if this is later on in John's life, wouldn't he get better at writing as he goes along?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I've got no beef with that.
And
that's a straw man argument.
It is a straw man, and it's making an assumption that fishermen are stupid.
It is.
And uneducated.
Right.
Now, again, the scripture does say these men are uneducated, but they're uneducated in the concept of the formal education that, say, like the Apostle Paul went through.
Or Pharisees, Sadducees,
Yeah,
which would be Paul. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
But that doesn't mean these guys were dumb. You go back and look at the farmers of the 1800s and go back and look at the tests that were given for 8th grade.
Right.
College graduates would struggle passing some of these tests.
I don't think we've gotten smarter.
No.
I don't think
not at all. TikTok would prove that.
Yeah.
Although I've never been on TikTok, but I hear stuff. So why is the Greek so different? Why is it? Because it's rougher. Mm-hmm. It's more abrupt. It's, kind of like maybe not necessarily street Greek like Mark, but it's definitely rougher. Mm-hmm. It has to do, remember, John is not writing an epistle encouraging people. He is writing down what he sees and what he was told to say.
Right.
And we're looking at apocalyptic, crazy things. And you can't imagine if he wrote Revelation in the style of 1 John. People struggle to understand it now when it's really direct and straightforward. Nobody would understand anything if he wrote it in a more flowery type of flowing, refined Greek. No, it needs to be abrupt because that's what apocalyptic literature is. All through the Bible, apocalyptic literature is very direct. It's very abrupt.
Well, there's right now we're in the time of grace.
Yes.
Right? Where we're trying to lead people to Christ because now's the time to receive forgiveness, correct?
Yes.
Well, there's going to come a time when there's not a time of grace and there's a time of judgment, right? Grace part's over. Now we're moving into judgment. It's kind of what John's writing about here.
Yes.
Given the fact that the subject matter are polar opposite, grace versus judgment, wouldn't that also make sense that the writing would be different?
I would think so. There's lots of reasons why.
Sure.
There's lots of reasons why. And again, we've talked about it before. Different situations, different audiences demand different writing styles. How about this? How about different messages and different purposes of writing?
Sure.
You demand different writing styles. So I don't have a problem with this at all. But some people did.
Right.
Some people did, even in like the 300s. Mm-hmm. So we'll discuss
I think it's also what John is viewing, though, because in the gospel, in his letters, he's talking about what he has seen, what he has felt with his hands. This is talking about what he's physically seen, what he's physically touched, right? When we're going to Revelation, we're kind of transitioning from physical things to spiritual things. Mm-hmm. And the one thing we know throughout Scripture is that spiritual things don't always translate well into the physical. Like you go to the book of Ezekiel, when people normally think about what angels look like.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen people actually do a depiction of what it actually, like a drawing of the angels? Weird looking, right?
It's weird, bro. Yeah.
So, the spiritual, when you're trying to translate it to the physical, it's like translating a foreign language. Going from one language to another, it's not always smooth. John is witnessing spiritual things, and they're being translated into physical. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the Gospels, he's witnessing physical things, and he's describing them in a manner in which he beheld physical. Yeah. I think it would make sense that it would be different.
Oh, it'd be weird.
Given what he is witnessing,
yes,
physical versus spiritual,
yes,
it would be different.
It absolutely would be different. And it says right in the beginning of Revelation 1:1 that these things were written in a symbolic fashion.
Right.
So if you're writing about symbols, if you provide too much detail, it's going to be a little weird. So you're going to have to make sure that you're writing with the right amount, and you're going to need to be direct.
Right.
You're going to need to be a little bit blunt in the way that you do it.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Next point. Cross-book fingerprints. Mm-hmm. Why the Gospels and the epistles sound alike. It's because they are alike. They were written by the same guy. That's why.
Okay. There you go.
That's why. But let's do a little bit of evidence on this. This concept of Jesus being the Word. Anytime you hear about Jesus being the Word, you automatically think of John.
Right.
Why is that?
Because he's the only one who uses it?
Yes. Only the writings of John use it.
And there's that poetic style we were kind of talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Jesus being the Word, and again, that was to combat Gnosticism because the concept of the Word is big in Gnosticism. And so you have John 1, it's used 3 times. In 1 John, it's used a couple of times as well. 1 John 1 is used a couple of times. So that connects John and 1 John.
There's the clear connection, yeah.
And then you have this concept of the word meno, which is abide. Not minnow, but meno. It's the word for abide. And John, and I think I use AI to track these numbers. I didn't actually look this one up. So take it with a grain of salt. But it looks right to me because I'm really familiar with the books. John, he uses the concept, but he uses the word 40 times. In 1 John, about 23. 2 John, he uses it 3. But it's really rare elsewhere. So this concept of abiding, little children abide in him. Right. This concept really flows out there quite a bit.
Well, you see how much it's being used in the Gospel of John, then less in 1 John, and then even less in 2 John. So again, I think we're seeing a little bit of progression of his writing style there. But also, 1 John is a lot shorter than the Gospel of John, and 2 John is shorter than 1 John.
Sure.
So it kind of makes sense that you would see it less and less as it continues. But the fact that it's still present, that says something.
Well, and actually, if you think about John being 21 chapters and 1 John being 5, using it 23 times versus 40, proportionally, it's used more in 1 John than it is in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, no, good point. Good point. Yeah.
So, but it's rare. It's rare elsewhere.
Sure.
You've got the concept of alethanos, and again, forgive the pronunciation. True, genuine. And John it's used 9 times. 1 John 3 times, and really is kind of the hinge at the end of 1 John when he's bringing his point home. And then you have the light-dark dualism going on, and we find that really, really tightly. So I just want to read something really quickly.
Sure.
I want to read John chapter 1. And Jeremiah, you got your Bible pulled up?
Yeah, let me grab it.
Why don't you pull up 1 John chapter 1.
Yep, I'm there.
Verses 5 through 7. And I'll read mine first, and then you read yours.
Okay.
So I'm going to read 4 through 9. It says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the light which coming into the world enlightens every man." So go ahead and read yours, and we'll see the connection.
1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 7 says, "This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin."
I mean, isn't that, it's very similar.
Very similar.
Very similar.
Very similar.
And then he focuses on the teachings of Jesus that lay this out too. When Jesus talks about it in John chapter 3, verse 19, he says, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds are evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for the fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices truth comes to the light so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God." See, so we're talking about the same author, man.
Right.
Because he's laying these concepts out very similarly in both sections.
Right.
All right. Now, there's also stylistic similarities. The sound and rhythm. So here's something that I learned that I didn't know before. There's something called the paratactic chi. That just sounds cool.
It does.
That's why I wanted to bring it out.
It sounds like a weird form of kung fu or something,
It kind of does.
Matt is a black belt in paratactic chi. So don't mess with him.
That's right.
Don't mess with
That's
him.
right. Also, really cool band name.
That would be, yeah. True.
Yeah, cool band
It could be.
Cool. Basically, it's really simple. It's using and. So that's what chi is in Greek. It's the conjunction and. It's using and all the time. And starting sentences with it. That is all through John. It's all through 1 John. It's these short, simple sentences. Now, there's the thing. It's a very Jewish, Semitic, Hebraic thing to do. because in the
To
Old
start a
Testament,
sentence with and, or just use and a lot?
use and a lot and start sentences with it.
Because it's kind of a no-no in English. You don't
It
start
is.
you don't start sentences with and or but or. What are those called? I forget.
Conjunctions.
Conjunctions. Okay, gotcha.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Right. So
Do you have no idea what that means, do you?
No, it was from a show. I remember.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Conjunction, junction.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll put a clip rather than me sing. But no, I know what you're talking about.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses.
Okay, but yeah, so in Hebrew that was acceptable to put a conjunction at the beginning of the
Yeah,
sentence.
they have a whole structure called vav consecutive, because vav is the letter for and 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 they just use it all the time, and because it would flip the tense of the verb when you use a vav consecutive. So you had to know, is it a vav consecutive or a vav conjunctive? It's just a very Hebrew thing to do.
Okay.
And so John's using that because guess what? John's a Jew. And especially in like Revelation, it's very, he uses lots of Semitic type of concepts. So here's the thing. But I don't know if the paratactica is in Revelation quite a bit. So I want to be upfront about that. In the Gospel of John, 250 times, paratacticais are used. In 1 John, it's 40 or 35 to 40. Right? That's a large amount for a small book.
It is.
3 times in 2 John, 4 times in 3 John. So these are those tiny little things. You would just read over it and skip it. But folks who spend a long time looking at this stuff say, man, this is something you got to pay attention to, this paratacticai, because it's not a normal style.
So the textual criticism would indicate, again, this is written by the same guy. Since this is not a normal style and we're seeing it consistently from the person who claims to have written it,
Yeah.
evidence would indicate
Yes.
that it's written by the same guy.
Yep, exactly. Okay. And another aspect here is there's a inverted parallelism, which is a really unique thing. Let's look at it real quick. So why don't you go to 1 John chapter 5, verse 12, and I'm going to go to John 3:36.
Okay. 1 John chapter 1, verse 12?
No, John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5, verse 12, and I'm going to go to John chapter 3, verse 36, since I'm already in John 3. All right, so John 3:36 says this. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. You go ahead.
And 1 John 5:12 says, whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God does not have life. Yeah, that's very similar.
Very similar.
That's very similar.
Very similar. And it's also found in 2 John verse 9, 3 John verse 11. So in the Gospel of John, there's 14 of them. In 1 John, there's 11 of them.
Yeah.
So there's just these internal little things about writing style that bring those things together. And then there's this, it's called a didactic editorial aside. Okay. In other words, where the writer is taking a second, pulls you off to the side and says, here's why I'm doing this. I want you to pay attention. Here's why I'm doing this. So you look up, since we're in 1 John, since you're in 1 John, I want you to go to 1 John chapter 1, verse 4, and I'm going to go to John chapter 7 and verse 39. So I'll do 7:39.
Okay.
He says, where he talks about, he who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. He says in verse 39, but this he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for the Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified. So John's like, let me pull you aside here for a second and show you how this works. And I'm going to also read chapter 12, verse 33, where he says, 33. Well, look at verse 32. And if I am lifted up above the earth or from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was going to die. So he's like, Jesus said this, but let me pull you aside and tell you why.
Here's why he said it.
in a very direct and upfront way. Now, check out chapter 1, verse 4.
Okay, it says, and we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete.
Right, and chapter 2, verse 1.
My little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous.
And chapter 2, verse 26.
Verse 26 says, I write these things to you about those who are trying to deceive you. Yeah, so he's being very poignant. I'm writing these things, and here's why.
Here's why.
Yeah.
I'm taking you aside, and I'm saying,
right.
This is why I'm doing this.
That's helpful stuff right there.
It's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, it is good. It is good.
I like
it's one of those things that you would normally just kind of gloss over
Yes.
if you're just reading it. But now that you have it pointed out, it kind of helps out because you're reading this, you're like, okay, well, that's cool. But why is this significant? And then he points it out. Well, here's exactly why.
Yeah.
Here's why you need to take note of these things that I'm telling you.
Yeah.
It's excellent. It's excellent.
And then in 2nd and 3rd John, he makes the point. He says, I have much to write.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, well, then you kind of wonder, well, why didn't you do it? You just made these short letters.
I'd rather not use pen and ink.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what he says.
Right.
So these are cool little internal things to let us know the continuity of how things work. So,
it certainly sounds like it's written by the same person.
but Revelation.
Sure.
Feels different.
It does.
Feels different. Again.
But we've talked about why it makes sense that it would.
Genre shift, apocalypse, rapid fire visions, heavy Semitic idioms.
Spiritual witnessing something spiritual versus physical.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the way I've heard it described is a Hebraic echo chamber, And again, I didn't count these, so I don't know, but it makes sense when you think about how much of Revelation is found in the Old Testament too. 500 Old Testament allusions to Semitic constructions. Again, that and is in there. It's everywhere. This guy just calls himself John, calls Jesus the Lamb, and title first introduced in the Gospels. And John chapter 1. Why use the same title? Matter of fact, if I did a message on this for a family camp last year. If I'm remembering it correctly, I might be wrong. I think John's the only one that uses this term to refer to Jesus.
As the Lamb?
Yes, that title. Now, Paul does say Jesus our Passover.
That's what I was thinking, our Passover
but
Lamb.
he doesn't say, I don't think he says Lamb there. I think Jesus our Passover has been sacrificed.
Is that what? Yeah, okay.
I could be wrong, but I don't believe the word Lamb is there.
Okay.
So, but again.
Alluding to Lamb is there.
Yes, the allusion to, but explicitly calling Jesus the Lamb, that's a John thing.
Interesting. Okay.
That's a John thing.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's used everywhere, 29 times in Revelation, and it's used a couple of times by John in chapter 1 of his gospel.
So, I mean, that's kind of a great connection there, where we're seeing the connection from the gospel to the book of Revelation.
Yep. I think so. All right. We're doing okay on time.
All right. Where are we at? A little over an hour? Okay.
Yeah, hour.
Great.
Yeah, a little bit over an hour because we had some weird stuff in the beginning.
We did.
We always cut that out. It's like the pep rallies at Walmart. We don't do pep rallies. It's okay.
We do not.
We should.
Maybe we should.
We should.
Maybe we should.
I have to come up with some sort of weird cheer.
So what are we doing? Are we keeping going? Or are we gonna save the rest for the next episode?
No. We're going.
We're going. All right.
We're going.
Let's keep. We pressing on.
Am I going too slow free?
No, not at all. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Faster.
It's got a cookout to get to. All right, patristic evidence. All right, this is going to be interesting. So you would think, all right, so these were written late, right? Gospel of John 80 to 90. So let's just kick it down the road and say 90.
Okay.
So between 90 and like 95, 96, we've got all 5 of these books more than likely being written, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would think that it takes a little while to accept, to understand these were written by John, to copy and disseminate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we would think maybe we're not going to see anything super early. Maybe 3rd century, maybe 4th century. No, let's look at this. And some of these we've already gone over.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't need glasses. I can see this. Extend my arms out. Papias. I wonder if everybody called him Pappy.
I would. That's how I would refer to him.
Yeah. Papias. In 110 to 120, preserved by Eusebius, says, if then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I questioned him in regard to the words of the elders. What Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip or Thomas or James or by John, or by Matthew, or by any of the disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristion, the presbyter, or in the presbyter John, disciples of the Lord, said. For I did not think that what was to be gotten from books would profit me as much as what came from a living and abiding voice. So my point is that Papias here, living very, very closely to the time of John, is listing John as, again, like this chain of custody almost of evidence that these people had access to still.
I'm also noticing that he's referring to them to the elders, the apostles, and John, again, he opens up 2 John with the elder.
This is where it gets interesting.
Okay. Am I getting ahead of us?
No.
Okay,
You're
gotcha.
fine. It's
I'm
a
just
good time to
noticing
bring
that.
it.
I'm like, okay.
No, it's a good time to bring it up.
Okay.
So I actually have it in my note to say that there were 2 Johns. So this is
okay. Gotcha.
You're always one step ahead. That's great. I love it.
Okay,
I love it. But it's perfect timing.
Trying to prepare the way. See what I did there?
I see what you did there.
All
That's
right.
nice. So you have the Apostle John, which is who we talked about in the chain of custody of the apostles: Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, or John.
Right.
But then he talks about the presbyter John, the elder John. These were 2 different people.
Yeah.
And so what some people did, and even Eusebius did this, they say when 2nd and 3rd John were being written, they were written by this elder John, not John the apostle. Or that's what some people say.
Right.
But the point is that the elder John was not the eyewitness. Let's see, that's why we've already established that whoever wrote the Gospel of John wrote 1 John, 2 John,
right,
and 3 John, because they're very similar.
Sure. Writing style, words usage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yep.
So John claims to be an eyewitness, and so does 1 John claims to be an eyewitness. John the elder was not that guy. He was not in the room during the Last Supper, during Passover. He was not at the cross being told to take care of Mary. He was not the guy that beat Peter to the tomb. So we know that this isn't the elder John that wrote this. And Papias isn't saying that. All he's saying is there was this dude called the presbyter John, the elder John. And people a couple hundred years later said, maybe that's the guy that wrote this. That's all they were saying, is that some people said that this is the case.
Okay.
So that's why I'm bringing it up. There's actually no evidence that Papias is saying John, the presbyter, the elder, wrote anything. He's just saying that guy existed.
Okay. Yeah,
so that's the only reason I'm bringing that up.
Gotcha.
Because this is where it comes from.
Yep.
This is where it comes from.
Okay. This is the origin of this. I gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So now Polycarp.
We brought him up a few times.
Many times. 110 to 135 in his letter to the Philippians actually quotes 1 John chapter 4, and he says, "For whosoever does not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh is Antichrist."
That is so close to when John wrote his books and Revelation even. I mean, that's really close.
Really close.
Whew.
Because Polycarp is a disciple of John. So you would think that the writings of John would make their way into the hands of the disciples, his disciples first.
Which seems to be the case here.
Yes. I mean, we're talking possibly 15 years, 14 years.
And it's so exact to what we have in our hands now. It means he had it in writing. That's what I would derive from that, is that he's got it in writing.
Yeah.
Not to say who would memorize the writings, but it seems like he has it in writing. And that can also, I mean, for some application to the cats that are listening, I mean, gives you confidence that what we have today, it's what they had then, very closely after it was written. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Now, this one we're probably going to discuss a little bit. Yeah, we got time. We're probably going to discuss this one a little bit because I think it's interesting. Justin Martyr, AD 150, in Rome, in his dialogue with Trypho. And the reason I'm mentioning it's Rome is a little ways away from Ephesus. Not super far away, but it is. He says, "There was a certain man with us whose name was John, one of the apostles of Christ."
Well, that's very specific. Okay.
That is. "Who prophesied by a revelation that was made to him that those who believed in our Christ would dwell 1,000 years in Jerusalem." All right.
Okay. Yeah. I know what you were going to talk about this one. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So first off, the part that we want to take away is that he's saying the guy who wrote Revelation is the Apostle John.
Right.
Okay. 50 years 54 years, 55 years after it was written.
Right. We're assuming, or not assuming, but saying that it was written 95 AD.
Yeah. I mean, so that's like somebody writing something in the late 60s and somebody today saying, yeah, they wrote that.
Easy peasy.
Right. Exactly. That's not a big stretch.
Not a big stretch at all.
But he writes that John wrote that Christ would dwell 1,000 years in Jerusalem. Now I see a lot of reels because we're starting to create. I'm starting to create a library for future episodes of things that we're going to be discussing.
All right.
And so I save these reels, and it's like, see, the early church writers, the patristic writers, were premillennial. They were dispensational. So dispensationalism is not something new that John Nelson Darby started in the 1800s. This is something that the patristic writers believed in way back when. Now, here's the actual story. You have something called dispensational premillennialism, which is a brand new invention from John Nelson Darby from the middle of the 1800s that says that, and we're not going to get into all this stuff right now, okay? That Israel is still the chosen nation of God, that there's going to be a pre-tribulation rapture, there's a 7-year tribulation, and then Jesus is going to come back and create a 1,000-year kingdom on earth, by which he will be a co-regent with David. Zadok the high priest is going to come, and they're going to offer memorial animal sacrifices to make the Jews feel comfortable and to remember all the things. And then there's going to be a mass falling away, and then the white throne judgment is going to take place because that Satan gets loose, all this stuff.
Pretty popular doctrine. That this
It's everywhere, especially, Iran and Israel are going at it right now. And so people are like, I've literally seen this on like X. You guys ready to be raptured?
Yeah. You see that anytime Israel appears in the news, though. It's like, this is it. Yeah. This is it.
Yeah. So you can probably tell I don't believe in the rapture. It's got a couple of passages that are referenced that don't say that at all.
In this episode of things that are taken out of context and stretched to new meanings.
I mean,
the rapture.
I don't know how you read 1 Thessalonians and say, oh, that's secret.
I mean, everybody's going to see it.
Voice of the archangel, the shout. I mean,
the trumpet.
Yeah, it's like, that screams secret to me. But anyway, that's, again, we're not going to get into all that.
If you want something to be secret, make sure everybody can see it.
Exactly. So there's something called historic premillennialism that believed that Israel was not the chosen nation of God, the church is, and that maybe there's going to be a final Antichrist, because 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, they believed that man of lawlessness was going to be the Antichrist, and that the church was spiritual now. It was on earth.
Right.
The kingdom of God was on earth through the church, that the church is the kingdom, not Israel.
I'm liking what I'm hearing so far.
Yes. And that Christ would reign from earth for 1,000 years based on Revelation 20. Okay. So there would be a earthly reign. So, but basically what they're saying is all that's going to happen is the spiritual kingdom is going to become the physical kingdom on earth for 1,000 years, and then the end will come.
Right. Okay.
That's classic premillennialism. And
that's the classic premillennialism? That's
classic. Well, there's a little bit more to it, but that's essential for our topic here for Justin's quote. That's what it's dealing with.
Gotcha.
And so, but people like to co-opt that and say these guys believed in dispensationalism. That's one tiny aspect of dispensationalism that they believed. And they believed categorically that the church was the Israel of God. I can provide quote, because I just did a message on dispensationalism at a family camp. I can provide you quote upon quote upon quote where early church writers stated categorically that the church was the Israel of God. This was not something that existed until much, much later. Okay. It is a new invention. Oh. So
how come always the critical stuff is always a new invention?
Well, and that's not even the critical stuff. That's the evangelical stuff.
Evangelical stuff, right?
Yeah. All right, next guy. Theophilus of Antioch, AD 180. One of the inspired men, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God.
See, now we're getting even further away.
Yeah.
And we're quoting John chapter 1.
Yes.
Pretty much to the letter.
Yes.
Or to the letter.
Yep.
I don't see any difference between that and my translation.
Yep.
Okay.
And
so good.
Now, Irenaeus of Lyon in AD 180. Again, France.
Right.
It's a little ways away.
A little ways away.
Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia.
Ooh.
So this has to be the apostle. And he's connecting it to the apostle John.
Yep. So Last Supper.
Yes.
The fact that the books were written in Ephesus.
Yes.
That's some good stuff in that
so
quote.
This distinguishes it from the elder John.
It does. It does.
That's really, and again,
right. Because the elder John did not lean up against Jesus's breast.
No, 80 years after, 84 years, 85 years after it was written.
Right.
Now, Irenaeus goes on to say, John also, the Lord's disciple, when beholding here's another pronunciation. Technically, apparently, according to AI, it's pronounced sacerdotal, but I've always heard it pronounced sacerdotal.
Okay.
It's a sacrament type language that's starting to take hold.
If it's a sacrament, I would go with sacerdotal. But
but I've always pronounced it potato.
Right, exactly.
John also, the Lord's disciple, when beholding the sacerdotal and glorious event of his kingdom, says in the Apocalypse, I turned to see the voice that spoke to me.
Ooh.
Again, same concept. He uses disciple to refer to him a little bit earlier, and that's the apostle.
Yep.
And then he says again, for many deceivers have gone out into the world who confess not that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Take heed to yourselves that ye lose not what ye have wrought.
Oh, now we're starting to see the King James translations.
Yeah. So that's when they got introduced.
Right, clearly.
Right. So again, quoting 1 John.
Yeah.
So we see here, I mean, like I said, 80 years, this chain of custody going on.
So, I mean, again, so the question of whether or not who wrote it was not an issue with the early church writers.
That's the conclusion we're going to come to as we finish
as we
the
continue.
evidence.
I see there's more here, which I love, because again, let's pile on the evidence. Why not?
We're all about piling on.
Yeah, let's pile it on.
And then we have the Muratorian fragment, which we've talked about before. But it says the fourth of the Gospels is that
What's
of John.
the date on this one? 170 to 200
Yeah,
AD?
thank you. Yeah, 170 to 200.
So now we're getting 205 years after the writing of Revelation. No, I'm sorry, 195?
Not even 100. If it's 170.
105. If it's the 200.
If it's a 200, it's 105. If
Math is hard.
It's like 70, 74, 75.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So
75 to 100 years.
Yep.
Okay.
The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, fast with me from 2 days to 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one, let him tell it to one another. It was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it.
Ooh.
So I think we've read that quote before when we were dealing with the synoptics, but we didn't really focus on it. But there, we focused on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to get into the 3rd century, so the 200s. We have Clement of Alexandria, AD 200. He says, but last of all, John, perceiving that the external facts had been made plain in the gospel, being urged by his friends and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel.
Sounds very much like we just read in the Muratorian fragment. Sounds very similar to that.
Yeah, and I love what Clement says here because he recognizes the difference. And again, we're talking about a little bit over 100 years. He's recognizing the difference. Look, the facts have been made plain in the synoptics.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, but now he's inspired by the Spirit to write a more spiritual, in other words, a more thematic one to combat what needed to be combated.
Right.
So I find that really great that people even this far, even this close to it, recognize the reason why there's a difference
in the writing style.
Yeah. And why John wrote the way he did in his gospel versus the synoptics.
Right.
It needed to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Tertullian of Carthage stated, John, however, in the Apocalypse is charged to chastise those who eat things sacrificed to idols. In his epistle, he designates as Antichrist those who deny that Christ has come in the flesh. So this is in his writing against heretics. So
is it prescription against heretics?
Yeah.
Is that the name of the writing?
I think so.
Take your medicine.
That's what I saw.
Take
your medicine.
So this is talking about what we kind of read about in 2 John.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then Origen, who, he was a heretic. or at least was labeled one later on. It says the same John in the Apocalypse gives him his name with the addition of God, where he says, and his name is called the Word of God.
Now, this is 240 AD.
Yeah.
About 150 years after.
Yeah.
The Revelation was written.
Yep.
Whew.
Yep.
All right.
So what kind of conclusions can we come from this? Well, from Papias to Origin, Asia Minor, Rome, Gaul, North Africa, Alexandria, every corner of the 2nd and 3rd century church ties the Apostle John to at least one, if not all 5 Johannine books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Recognition appears within a generation of the apostle's death. Later 4th century's councils merely ratified what the churches were already reading. I can't emphasize that enough, right? They did not establish the canon. They recognized what the church had already been doing.
Right.
I don't like revisionist history. And this concept of creating or of resting authority in these councils, these were also regional councils.
Right.
They weren't Catholic
not worldwide,
councils.
Not worldwide.
No.
Regional councils.
So, and by the way, Carthage and Hippo are not Rome. Right. Council of Laodicea, not Rome.
Right.
You know, so anyway, even stylistic objectors like Caius and Dionysius grant that the book's early circulations, or they talk about how those weren't, especially Revelation, shouldn't be accepted,
Mm-hmm.
Or that John didn't write them. One said they shouldn't be accepted. The other one said it shouldn't. John didn't write it versus it shouldn't be accepted. I get them confused. Well, again, we'll lay them out next time. But the fact that they're talking about it in the 2nd or 3rd century, maybe beginning of the 4th, lets you know that these things were in circulation.
Right. Right.
You know, because you're not going to talk about them if they're not in circulation.
You're not going to rebut them if they're not in circulation.
Yep.
There'd be no need to rebut them. Okay.
Now, 3rd John didn't get quoted in the early years, probably due to its content, like we talked about, right?
We don't talk about 3rd John.
And some, you know, it's the weird cousin or uncle that you know we leave in a corner at family reunions.
Right.
But you know, it was accepted though,
Mm-hmm.
because it is in the canon list.
Yep.
And Origen writes this actually in 240. He says, but John also left one epistle of very few lines, suppose further a 2nd and a 3rd, for not all accept these as genuine, yet they are read publicly in most of the churches, and the two together do not contain 100 lines. He's talking about 2nd and 3rd John.
Yeah.
And he's like, some don't accept them because they're probably like, what's this for? Right. But he's like, they're read in the churches.
Mm-hmm.
And then Athanasius in his Festal letter listed the 27 books of the New Testament, and all the writings of John were in there. So
the gospel, 1st,
Yep.
2nd, 3rd, and Revelation.
Yep. And that's 3rd or 4th century. So manuscript evidence, we're going to zip right through this.
Sure.
Okay. So based upon where we're talking about, we're in the writings of John, the earliest possible fragment of the New Testament from about 125. Guess what book it's from? Guess what? The earliest fragment of the New Testament that exists. Guess what book it's a fragment of?
Gospel of John?
Gospel
of John. How about that?
P52, found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. And again, a lot of times the papyri that you find are going to be found in Egypt because they degrade very quickly. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the style or the geography and climate of Egypt held to preserving these things. Mm-hmm. So P52. And it's the two quotes are, Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. And then the next one, Jesus answered, for this reason I have been born, and for this I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Again,
it's what we have today.
It is.
So many people make that argument that you can't trust the Bible because it's like the book of telephone. It's been translated, and that person translated the translation, and that person translated the translation. When we look at this, we see, no, what we have today has been preserved. It's the same thing that was written down when the ink hit the paper.
Yep. I mean, there are variants, which we'll get into with our guest that's going to be coming in, and some of them, a couple of them are a little bit substantial, but it's not anything that, number one, can't be answered and that can't be walked through with the incredible amount of evidence that exists.
Right.
We can know very, very securely and confidently what the original stated.
Yep.
So that's very important. P66, which was found, it's a Bodmer 2 papyri. That's 175 to 200, and it's a near complete copy of the Gospel of John, from what I've seen.
Gotcha.
Chapters 1 through 21. Opening leaf reads, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God."
Yeah, that sounds very much like John chapter 1.
Sure does, doesn't it? P75, also found during the 175 to 200 time frame, has John 1:14. P45, the Chester Beatty, I think that's how you pronounce it, fragmentary of John chapters 10 and 11. And then, of course, you have Sinaiticus, first complete gospel text, preserves every verse through 21-25. So here we're looking at copies of the Gospel of John, starting all the way back to within 35 years of its writing, all the way through the first major copies found within 100 years of its writing. First John, P9, and that's also found in Oxyrhynchus, early 3rd century. But then again, we have Vaticanus, which was 325 to 350, earliest copy of First John. So again, not a ton of First John out there, but we do see that there was something early 3rd century. Second John, first full text that we have is in fragment Sinaiticus, which you would expect with the little epistles.
Right.
And then Third John, Vaticanus as well. So yeah, complete letter. Now, Revelation, this is really interesting. So Revelation being the last book written, around 96, right? 95. P98, 125 to 175.
So that's like 30 years after.
Yeah.
30 years after. Found in Egypt. In Egypt. That's incredible.
Yeah. So
I mean, there's a little bit of different distance between Ephesus and Egypt.
There is.
Turkey and Egypt. So 30 years after that, we've got a copy in Egypt. Yeah.
Yep. And the copy says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last.'" And again, like you keep mentioning, how accurate are these things to what we have?
I mean, some of these I read a couple days ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really kind of amazing to think that people were reading the exact same thing 2,000 years ago. Yep. And the preservation is there.
Yep.
That says something, man. I mean, and it doesn't objectively prove divine inspiration, but the fact that some text can remain the exact same over 2,000 years all over the world.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
All right.
Like I said, some people get really nervous about diving into these types of things because they're like, "Oh no, this is really going to challenge my faith." And I don't know. I mean, curiosity killing my faith. And through, I think both of us, and we've heard from a lot of people who watch the podcast that, man, they're actually encouraged to dive into these things, and they're doing it, and their faith is being strengthened.
Right.
Because you have to make sure you have balanced approaches to your sources, and you challenge the presuppositions.
That's part of the reason why we're trying to be so thorough.
Yes.
And looking at all these, if we just looked at one person, that's not a whole lot. But if we're looking at multiple sources that are verifying the same thing, that helps to build a very strong case.
Exactly. And there's several others for Revelation, P115, P47, again, mid to early 3rd century, so mid to early 200s. And then, of course, Sinaiticus has it, in there as well. So here's the takeaway for this section. Every Johannine book is anchored to physical manuscripts no later than the 4th century, so the 300s. 4 of the 5 enjoy 2nd or early 3rd century support from the papyri.
Incredibly close.
Yep.
Incredibly close to when they were written.
By the 300s, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus gathered, most or all of the 5 Johannine writings. So Sinaiticus includes all 5. Vaticanus omits Revelation. And both omit the adulterous woman narrative.
In John 8?
In John 7:53 to 8:11.
Goes into John 8. Right, yeah,
Yep.
okay.
And the guest that we're going to have, he actually has done a lot of study on the ending of Mark and John 8.
The ones that says some manuscripts exclude these.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'm specifically asking him to go over that in a way that me, who's a dummy when it comes to textual criticism, can understand. So, he can get really technical because he knows this stuff inside and out, but he is absolutely convinced that these things belong in there.
Sure.
So I'm excited to when we actually get into that. Now, let's wrap up. Why? Well, kind of wrapping up, so to speak. Why it matters. Why does this whole thing matter, especially when it comes to the church recognizing the canon, not manufacturing it? F.F. Bruce, I think, sums up my view on this exceedingly well. He was a very eloquent individual, and he says the New Testament books did not become authoritative for the church because they were formally included in a canonical list. On the contrary, the church included them in her canon because she already regarded them as divinely inspired, recognizing their innate worth in general apostolic authority, direct or indirect. That apostolic authority is the part that's exceptionally important.
Yeah.
Right? What the early church writers did, they appeal, what do the early church writers appeal to for authenticity and authority of each book? Who wrote it?
Yeah.
Who wrote it?
So this is kind of different where a lot of people today, they'll say, well, I believe it because it's in the Bible, because it's in a list. So what this guy is saying is like, look, it's not because it's in a list.
Yep.
It's because of we're recognizing where it came from.
Yes.
We don't believe it because it's in a list. We ask the question, why is it in a list?
Yep.
That's the question. Not is it in the list? It's why is it in the list?
Yes.
Because of where it's coming from.
Because of where it's coming from. Absolutely.
Right.
And that's why we can reject the Apocrypha.
Who's it coming from?
Who's it coming from?
Right.
So, and the Jews rejected it too.
Right.
Because it's, the Old Testament side of it. Now, let's think about this. The people who wrote the books of the New Testament, they recognized the inspiration in the offices of the apostles, and the people traveling with them would have had written down the inspired teaching. So let's think about this. We have 4 direct apostles.
Matthew, Mark, John.
Nope. Matthew, John, Peter, and Paul.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah,
So those are the 4
So
direct
I wanted to
ones.
say, I always think when I think Gospels, because people say, what happened to the Apostle Luke? I'm like, well, he wasn't an apostle just because he wrote a Gospel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But we recognize that Mark is probably Peter's Gospel.
Right.
Okay.
But Matthew, John, Paul, and Peter,
Yep.
they write the majority of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
They're apostles.
Right.
They're apostles. And the apostolic assistants, Mark and Luke.
Right.
And we know from Papias that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. So Mark's gospel is probably the gospel of Peter.
Yep.
And Luke researched everything, but he was the traveling companion of Luke.
I mean,
traveling companion of Paul.
And we read about that in the book of Acts.
We read that about the book
Right.
of Acts. So
Eyewitness testimony.
So a lot of the gospel of Luke is probably the gospel that was revealed to Paul. Now people
Right.
say, well, Paul wasn't an eyewitness. No, but Jesus gave him the gospel. Now I know that's an internal claim, but you look at the life of Paul, there's no reason why, I think I might have just said Peter there a second ago, but Paul received the gospel from Jesus Christ directly. Right. And they say, well, he wasn't an eyewitness. No, but you can't argue with the life of Paul.
Well, even so, I mean, Peter writes in his letters that he recognizes Paul's letters as being divinely inspired as well.
Well, people say Peter didn't write that. We're going to get that
yeah.
one into the last section on canon.
Well, I guess they would have to in order to discredit Paul, wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And then you have the brothers of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
James and Jude.
Yep.
And then you have the book of Hebrews, which we're going to get into after we get done with the writings of John. And so here's the question. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? It is anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the earliest churches in the East said it was Paul. And people reject Paul's authorship based upon a couple of internal things, which we'll get into.
Mm-hmm.
But the Western churches hesitated, but yet eventually they still receive it because it has an apostolic voice.
Sure.
Which it really does. If you read the book of Hebrews, I mean, this person understood the intricate doctrines very, very well.
Absolutely.
And what their implications
and
were.
that book is so critical to the New Testament because the way it bridges the Old to the New is really amazing.
It's
a critical book of the
Yes.
New Testament. People say, well, I've heard people say 3rd John is not needed for the New Testament. It's like now I think it is needed for the completeness, but Hebrews is one of those books that is so incredibly critical to the New Testament because of how it bridges the gaps.
It's essential.
It is.
It's essential. And Athanasius, in his Vestal letter in 367, talking about the scriptures, he said, "These are fountains of salvation, and these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. Let no man add to these, neither let him take away from these."
It sounds like what John wrote at the end of Revelation.
It does, doesn't it?
It does.
But in this next quote, you can start to see the shift that takes place. And it's written by none other than our favorite guy, Augustine.
Okay.
"Among the canonical scriptures, he will judge according to this standard, to prefer those that are received by all the Catholic churches to those which some do not receive." So now again, we have to define Catholic here real quick. So Catholic, mainly before the foundation of the beginning of the Catholic Church, was just simply used for the term universal. That's what Catholic means, universal. So small c. Later on, it became a big C, like a title. And that's really what Augustine is referring to here, I believe, is
universal churches.
Universal churches. But he says he's laying out a standard. And he says the standard is to prefer those that are received by all the universal churches to those which some do not receive. So he's saying there's a standard, and the standard is, what do we approve of? This is where we start to see the shift into more authoritative.
Right. Prefer those received by all churches. So here's this like, well, if we agree universally. And that's not the right approach.
No, it's not.
Just because we all agree on something, that doesn't mean it's right or true.
Exactly.
So that's the issue. I'm picking up what you're laying down there.
And so that's the lens that people look at the councils through then.
Right.
So they say, well,
they all agreed on it.
Council of Carthage and Council of Hippo, they approve these, so therefore this is the authoritative list. No, they rubber stamped what was already accepted for the most part. Now there's a couple that were a little bit iffy, but they were already established, as we can see from Athanasius in 367, and Augustine writing that in 396, but then the Council of Carthage in 397, where they say the canon was fully formed. I mean, that's 30 years later.
Yeah.
But Athanasius is saying all of these were already established. Right.
Yeah.
So then they would have been established before that too. Okay. So, and then the Council of Carthage says, of the New Testament, 4 Gospels, Acts, 13 epistles of Paul, 1 to the Hebrews, 2 of Peter, 3 of John, 1 of James, 1 of Jude, and in the Apocalypse of John.
Okay.
So here's the starting to bring it home here. The early church never treated John's 5 books as borderline. 3rd John, a little bit, again, because of what it was written.
But that was more for personal reasons.
The same criteria that admitted Mark, Luke, James, and Jude also safeguard Revelation, despite its stylistic quirks. Apostolic source, universal church use.
Right.
Therefore, we're going to defend John's authorship, John the Apostle's authorship on these. So we looked at the 5 books, 1 apostle, eyewitness voices echoing what we already saw. We looked at Polycarp, Irenaeus, Athanasius, all of these different guys. We looked at the papyri, saw that evidence. And really, it boils down that the Apostle John wrote these.
We can prove that through textual.
Yep.
And it was recognized by the early church writers that he wrote that. So we can have confidence that what we have now was written by the Apostle John.
And what we're going to do is we're going to let that evidence stand and do battle with the criticisms that we're going to look at next episode.
Hence why we had to kind of go through this today.
Yes.
Here's the evidence that we have to prove and have confidence that these were written by John. And we also have the early church writers, people who were much closer to him than we were, also accepting that these were written by John.
Yep.
So now we're going to fast forward in time and we're going to talk about the people who were not close to John, who are criticizing whether or not he actually wrote them and they should be recognized.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So we can have that confidence, man. And we can also have the canon confidence that, it's not based on ecclesiastical paperwork.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's this guy that sat on Jesus's, or that leaned back on Jesus' chest, said it is finished.
Yeah.
And we can just trust that.
For the most part, I like the fact that we went through this to kind of show the similarities between John's letters and his gospel and Revelation to prove that it's the same author. But again, what really does for me is early church writers who were just so absolutely close to him, and they're quoting his books and the same thing that we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, that should take your confidence from here to here.
Yeah. I mean, we're not talking about necessarily eyewitness, but we're talking about really close to the time frame.
Right.
So I don't know why Johns are so controversial. I mean, I do. It's
based on what we talked about for third.
It's what's
John.
in them.
Right.
Yeah. It's what's in them.
Right.
Yeah. So next episode, right? We're gonna steal man Ehrman and all those guys and really present what they believe.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to water it down. I want to present it. I want them to come with their best shots. We're going to look at the 2 John theorists and the style skeptics, and we'll present their best evidence as they present it. And then we'll see if it stands or not.
Awesome.
And I think when we're done, John's still going to be standing. I mean,
I imagine so.
you got, from Galilee to Patmos, right? I mean, John's voice, in my opinion, hasn't cracked in 2,000 years.
Why is he going to do it
It's
now?
pretty solid.
Yeah.
And if he can handle the fire of persecution, the fire of Patmos, he can handle a YouTube comment section.
I would think so. I would think so.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you guys have really enjoyed this episode. Now, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Again, we are on YouTube. We are on Spotify.
Yes, sir.
So would appreciate a follow. Hit that like button. Hit the bell so you're notified when new episodes come out. Next time, you're going to see the exciting conclusion of this episode on August 1.
Yes.
August 1. So next time, remember, I'm Jeremiah, and the curiosity I don't want to mess it up from last time. Curiosity may have killed the cat.
That was smooth.
Thank you. But you got to finish it.
But it doesn't have to kill you. And I'm Matt. Have a great day.
Have a good one.